All right, so this is another start where I'm hoping that you can draw on some previous knowledge about genetics. I'm thinking most of you at least had a high school biology class someplace where you learned some basic concepts related to genetics, and maybe some of you have even taken human bio or perhaps even our genetics course here at the college, in which case you'll be relatively well informed. But I'm going to start with just some basic ideas because I don't know kind of where everybody is with that as a background. And so for some of you, this is going to be a pretty basic review at the beginning here. So essentially, I'm hoping that you guys know that we each have 23 pairs of chromosomes, which means 46 chromosomes, but we tend to talk about them in pairs. And that our genetic material gets transmitted to us on these chromosomes. And there's pairs because we get 23 from each parent, and they are paired. So you have 23 from mom, 23 from dad, and then you wind up with 23 pairs. And the idea of heritability, that word heritability, just refers to how likely it is that certain traits are developed because of genetics as opposed to because of experience in some way. And so, for example, we understand that our eye color is highly heritable, that what color our eyes are is not because of decisions we've made or experiences we've had, but because of the genes we've gotten from our parents. And we tend to look at group data to give us those numbers. And so we tend to look at genetically related pairs to see how likely it is that they share a trait, and talk about the heritability of a trait that way. So we know that if you have curly hair, right, you're seeing my hair a little bit more curly today. If we have curly hair, and we look at pairs of people to see whether pairs of parents and children, let's say, right? So we look at child parent pairs to see how consistent a trait is across those pairs. So if we look at pairs of mothers and daughters, and 95% of the time, I'm making these numbers up, 95% of the time they share either having curly or straight hair, then we would say that hair texture is 95% heritable, because 95% of the time those biologically related pairs, the mother-daughter pairs, share the trait. And so that is a very straightforward way of kind of deciding that. The other term you'll hear here is concordance rate, and concordance rate is about that 95. And so heritability is not so much about the number. We might, it is about the idea that something is highly heritable or not very heritable. But concordance rates refer to that number. And so it's about the degree of similarity. And this really is a correlation. That is the way to understand concordance rates, is that correlation. And the other term, I want to come back to concordance rates in a second, but the other term before we leave this slide is the idea of genotype and phenotype that I hope you're familiar with. Genotype is about heritability. It is about these chromosomes. That genotype is about our genome. It's about what genetic material we possess. Whereas phenotype is about the observable traits, and we're going to talk a lot about the fact that these are almost never the same, that we can carry genetic material that isn't easily observable in our traits. We might carry genetic material that makes us more likely to develop one trait or another, but other factors then interfere or intervene to dictate whether or not we actually have that trait. So we'll come back to that idea. But let's think about concordance rates here for just a moment. And this is an example of concordance rates for schizophrenia. We'll actually look at this again when we're talking about schizophrenia, but I'm just using it here as an example. And you can see that the more highly genetically connected two people are, so in this case, monozygotic twins or identical twins who share 100% of their genes, have a much higher concordance rate at 48% for schizophrenia. Than other pairs do. And again, what we mean by concordance rate is if we take 1,000 twin pairs, monozygotic twin pairs, and we see that we take pairs of people where one twin has schizophrenia, and then we look to see what are the chances that the other twin also develops schizophrenia. And the answer to that question is 48%, that if we have 1,000 twin pairs, one of whom has schizophrenia, that 48% of the time their identical twin will also develop schizophrenia, right? So it is a measurement of correlation. It's a measurement of similarity. If we take two random people, it's the general population, right? If we take two up here at the top, if we take two random people, we only expect to see a 1% overlap. So we take a group of people who have schizophrenia, and then for each one of them, we match them with a random stranger. Only 1% of the time will our pairs both develop schizophrenia. But you can see, for example, that if we take you and your niece or nephew, or you and an aunt or uncle, right? And have pairs of that, where one's a niece and nephew and one's an aunt or uncle, and let's say the aunt or uncle has schizophrenia, there's only 4% similarity, and another way of talking about that is there's a 4% risk of the niece or nephew developing schizophrenia based on the fact that they have an aunt or an uncle with schizophrenia. Now, I want to talk about one thing here. Sometimes you'll say, like, having an aunt or uncle with schizophrenia quadruples your risk of having schizophrenia. And that sounds really scary, quadrupling the risk, 4 times the risk. But when something's only occurring at 1%, the risk is only a 1% risk, and we can quadruple that, and we're still at only 4% risk, which means there's a 96% chance you're not going to develop schizophrenia. And I think that's a really important thing to pay attention to. So you can take a look at these numbers on your own. You can ask questions about them if you want in our live discussion. But this is just an example of what we mean when we're talking about concordance rates. When we're talking about genetic information, I just want to kind of map out this kind of hierarchy, and this goes from kind of the largest genetic concept we can look at to the smallest one. As we already talked about our 23 pairs of chromosomes. Those chromosomes are all made up of genes, and genes have allele variations, meaning that we can have a specific gene for hair curliness or straightness, hair texture, and then there are several possible alleles you might inherit on that gene for that gene. So they're variations of the gene. So you might inherit a curly hair gene, you might inherit a straight hair gene. You might be familiar with the idea of alleles when we're talking about certain illnesses. So people might get genetic testing to see if they carry certain risky alleles for breast cancer, right? So you may know people who've done that. When they say I have the gene for, what they really mean is that they have the allele, they have the gene variation that puts them at higher risk for breast cancer. So alleles are variations in genes. They're the menu items that you're going to, your genetic roll of the dice is going to choose from to say which of these specific genes will you have for hair color or eye color or breast cancer. And then alleles and genes are made up of DNA and RNA. And really, what's really interesting to most researchers right now is that DNA and RNA are made up of proteins. And, probably about 20 years ago, we mapped the human genome. We thought we were going to kind of be done and have so much information about our human genes. And what happened is that we realized that really all of the really important information is about proteins and about variations at the protein level. And so when we talk here, there's not going to be any situation in our conversations about genes where we're going to talk about a gene for schizophrenia or a gene for depression. But what we will refer to at various times is the idea that that changes in proteins are going to change what traits we see. They're going to change what our phenotype is. And changes to proteins can happen because of biological and genetic information, but also can be influenced by environmental information. So this is this idea of epigenetics that we're going to come to, where things that we experience in our environment impact the actual structure of our genes in some way. But we'll come back to that in a little bit. And so come back to this idea of genotype and phenotype, right? We said what these were before, that phenotype is the traits we see, and genotype is our actual genome. And there are some genetic mechanisms that can determine why those are different. So you might have a recessive gene, right? So I know I carry a recessive gene for blue eyes, for light color eyes. My father has blue eyes, and blue eyes is a recessive gene. And that means that you need to have inherit the information for blue eyes, that allele. You have to inherit that allele from both parents in order to have blue eyes. My mother clearly gave me brown-eyed allele because I have brown eyes, but but my father only had blue-eyed allele to contribute because he has blue eyes. So he has two, both pairs are for blue eyes. And so I know I carry the allele for blue eyes, and I married a blue-eyed man. Jim has blue eyes. And so he only has blue-eyed allele to contribute to chromosomes. And so we have one blue-eyed child. Nick has blue eyes. He inherited the recessive gene that I carry. And my other two kids have brown eyes, but they both carry the recessive gene that their father gave them as well. Right, so my genotype includes an allele for blue eyes, but my phenotype, what you see if you look at me, is only for brown eyes. And so that's how recessive genes dictate that. Polygenic traits are very, very common. All psychological traits are polygenic, and poly meaning many, right? All this means is that any behavioral or emotional trait that I carry is being dictated, is being informed by many different genes, not just a single gene ever. And so it's part of what makes understanding behavioral genetics so difficult because it's so complicated. But it also means that there's not going to be a circumstance where you inherit a single gene from a parent and that is going to be a behavioral trait that you now carry. And so it's also protective in some ways. It also gives us great variation in human behavior because it's not that you're just dealing with a handful of alleles, and so you either have curly hair or straight hair, right, or blue eyes or brown eyes or green eyes, but that our behaviors and our emotions are much more varied because of how many more factors are informing them. And then we have modifier genes, and modifier genes, the only job of this gene or these genes is to change the expression of other genes. And so we're back to this volume idea that we talked about a little bit before, that modifier genes either turn up the volume of other genes and say you get to talk more, you get to have more of an influence, or they turn down the volume on other genes and say you don't get to talk as much, you don't get as much of an influence. And so the idea that there's genes that just influence how other genes behave or inform is really important. Right, so we just talked about alleles in terms of individual genetic differences, and this is about why am I so much different than you. And then we have these other things that I mention here only because you're going to see them come up later. Copy number variations happen in the replication of genes, and we can get just more genes on a certain chromosome that it might multiply in more ways than it should have. This is not going to result in the kinds of disruptions we get when we have too many chromosomes. So when we have a triploid, like trisomy 21 or Down syndrome, when we have that happening at the chromosomal level, we get more widespread changes in presentation, and so more deviation from typical presentation in more ways. But this, when we're talking about copy number variations, this is about genes, not about chromosomes, and so it doesn't have that kind of very noticeable effect that we see with chromosomal triploid. And then single nucleotide polymorphisms are about changes that are occurring at the protein level. We're going to talk a little bit about these when we talk about schizophrenia, because the research on schizophrenia seems to be pointing to this kind of atypical genetic material. Okay, so we're going to stop here with this video and pick up with the next video talking about epigenetics to make sure that you understand what epigenetics is.